Historical Happy Hour, the podcast that explores new and exciting historical fiction novels. I'm your host, Jane Healy, and in today's episode, we welcome author Brooke Lea
Wonderful.
Foster to discuss her latest novel, All the Summers in Between, which just released. Set in the dual timelines of 67 and 77, it's been called a mesmerizing portrait of a complex friendship, a delicious glimpse into a bygone Hamptons, and a powerful coming of age for two young women during a transformative era. Welcome, Brooke. Thank you for coming
Thank
on.
you. I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you. I'm going to do a quick bio and then we'll jump right into questions.
Great.
Brooke Lea Foster is an award-winning journalist whose articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post Magazine, the Atlantic, the Boston Globe Magazine, and People, among others. As an alumna of the Writing Institute at Sarah Lawrence College, she is the author of three nonfiction books and the novels Summer Darlings, On Gin Lane, and All the Summers in Between. Thank you again for
Yay.
coming.
No, I'm so excited. I love hearing that because I'm like, oh my gosh, I actually wrote a third novel.
I know, number three.
You
Congratulations.
know that feeling. It's just like, it's crazy when you hear multiple books, right?
Yes, I know, I know. And it's awesome. So congratulations on the latest. And we were just talking before we came on because we both have some Maine connections, and you came up with the premise for this story while you were on vacation in Maine. Is that right?
Yes, we were. So it was a couple summers ago. We were up in the Boothbay Harbor area, and we were staying in one of those like quaint New England inns where they offered this service where you could take a little Boston whaler into town for dinner. So my husband, yeah, it was really fun. So of course we were doing that. So my husband and my kids, we got on the boat and we were just kind of puttering across the harbor around maybe dusk. And I looked up and I saw this very charming but modest gingerbread Victorian house up on a grassy hill. And there was a young woman outside hanging laundry on the line and a little girl doing cartwheels at her feet. And it was just such an old-fashioned image. Like, I want to say she was wearing an apron, even though I know she wasn't, because that's exactly what I saw. I just was immediately, transported back in time. And right as I was kind of looking at that, it was just like a second, an imprint. A boat came by into the frame, and it was this really glossy teak power boat. No, sailboat. Sorry, it wasn't a power boat. I was in the Talented Mr. Ripley for a second, but in my mind, it was it was an actual sailboat. And I just had this vision of these two women. I knew I wanted to write about friendship, but I had no idea what my way in was. And at that moment, I just saw these two women, and that was it. I knew one would be rich and one would kind of be a local beach girl. And then as we were driving back from that vacation and we were kind of going over the bridge in Maine where you kind of come into Portsmouth, New Hampshire.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you know that spot. I turned to my husband and I was like, "Oh my God, I think I have my next book idea," because the women just started developing in my mind. And of course, the kids are in the back seat saying like they have to, these women have to be kidnapped by aliens and robots have to be involved. And I'm like, that is not happening. We're going back in time. I didn't know when in time I was going to go back. I just knew I wanted to, I always set my books in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So anyway, when I got home from that trip, I started working on this book, and the two women started to form and get clearer and shape in my mind. And that's kind of the beginning of the book.
So interesting how different people's processes are. So the characters came first in this instance. It sounds like it.
In this instance, the characters came first. Yeah.
And how do you develop characters? Like I know some authors do like write essays, that the characters write like in the character's voice, or like do they have like profile sheets? Like do you do any of that, or you just kind of feel your way along?
Okay, so I wish I was one of those writers who did
Yeah.
all of that because right? Because I think it would make you such a more efficient writer. But I always say, and if anyone on this podcast has heard me before, you will have heard me say this. I always write really rough, really dirty, really messy. I just don't care that it's going to be bad. And I find out a lot about my characters just through discovery, just through writing and putting them in different situations and seeing where the story is going to go. And I think I can do that because of my years as a journalist. For many years I was reporting and, getting information and figuring out how to shape it and writing really fast on deadline and knowing that I was going to go back in and carve it and shape it and turn it into something that was ultimately going to be very readable. And so I know, even though, of course, I'm a writer that always feels somewhat lost and like you're in the dark with a flashlight trying to figure out your way when you're writing a draft, I just know that I'll get there because I'll get there in revision, which is what I love. I feel like the first draft and the figuring out these characters is really just kind of birthing them on the page. And it's a really, for me, it's the absolute hardest part of the process and somewhat the least enjoyable for that reason. But I love going back and rewriting and revising and really figuring out who they were. With these particular characters, they were a little more clear to me than some of my other characters from the start. And I think that's just because of the class divide between them. I knew I wanted one to be a wealthy city girl who summered out. So, by the way, everyone, I transferred this story from Maine to the Eastern Long Island, which is where I grew up and where I spend my summers. And that's mostly just because I know it so well out here. I had done a lot of historical fiction reporting out here, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point. And Maine, I love Maine and I want to set a book in Maine and I know I will, but it's not in my blood the way it is for you, Jane. It's not that I grew up summering there. I'm a new, a total newbie to Maine. And while I've gone there the past 5 years, it's just not, I didn't grow up there. So it doesn't come as instinctually close. Um, so anyway, so I moved it to the Hamptons and but I forgot my way. Oh, the characters. So I
Yes.
knew that I wanted it to be in a town that was very much the difference between the people, the haves and the have-nots, basically in the town. So I wanted one of the young women to kind of have these very illustrious city parents, and I wanted this local hardscrabble girl to meet this other young woman and just think she has it all. And as she gets to know her and gets closer to her, realize that she really doesn't have as much as she thinks. She's actually struggling and as brokenhearted as my local character, Thea. And I knew very early on that Thea her mom was going to have passed away and she was going to carry this baggage in her family. So those were sort of early defining characteristics. And I do think that really helped shape them as I went along because I kind of knew one was going to be a little more selfish and one would be very, wear her heart on her sleeve and be much more vulnerable and giving. And kind of starting with that dynamic and then deepening it and playing with it was kind of where I went. So,
So interesting. So Margot and Thea, this takes place in 1967 and 1977, and I'm super curious, like, why did you choose those time periods for the story? And the girls are quite young when they first meet in 67, and then it's kind of, they're inching towards 30 when they meet again, when they reunite. So I'm
yeah.
yeah, so it's such an interesting time period to write about, and I'm curious about your choice.
So when I was trying to figure out where in time to set them, I considered my other timelines, that time periods that I'd worked on. So I had set a book in 1957 and I had set a book in the early 60s. And both of those time periods are somewhat similar. Those were the 50s women were coming off of World War II where they were working outside of the home. And suddenly in the 50s, they're, back, there's all this pressure to be in a nuclear family and they're click-clacking through the local markets dressed fabulously with their hair done and having, drinks ready at supper. And we see all these like really sexist, hilarious Cosmo articles from this time where, women were told how to keep their husbands happy by like rubbing their feet when they got home and having a fire crackling in the fireplace and making sure they were all beautiful. And so it's like this very glamorous time on the outside. But what we know is that women were really struggling on the inside, from Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique coming out in 1962 or 61 and no us kind of seeing how much women at that time really relied on the mother's little helper pill. And I knew that I didn't want my girls then, that wasn't the right time period for them. But when I started thinking about the late 60s, I love this idea of being at a point in time where women were riding a tide of optimism. They had this sense that things really were going to be different. Singers are singing about change. You've got the National Organization for Women has been formed. In Congress, they're talking about adding a sex discrimination clause to the Equal Rights Amendment. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen until 1971, but they're talking about it.
Mhm.
And so I just love this idea of like women popping political buttons and really thinking about their futures in a really empowered, different way. And then I chose to reunite them in the late 70s rather than the 80s or the 90s because the 70s were so fascinating because all of these marches and this change and Grace Slick singing about, we're the parents your people warned you, your parents warned you about, us versus them and young versus old. We get to the late 70s and all of that just falls flat. like a big hangover. I always say it's like a big hangover because that's really what it felt like. And women in the late 70s found themselves actually living a life very similarly to what their mothers had lived. They found themselves still taking on the bulk of housework. If they were working outside of the home, which more of them were doing, they were making 62 cents on the dollar compared to men. So I love the idea of having these two characters sort of, in this really optimistic time of change and thinking about their lives and their futures together and daydreaming about all the possibilities and then losing touch because they grow estranged for 10 years, but reuniting and realizing that they haven't quite, attained those dreams. And there's a lot of disappointments and regret. And when friends come back into our lives from our childhood, I think there's a piece of us that is kind of us reassesses where we're at, how far we've come. And when they're suddenly thrust back together, they end up doing that. Thea sort of thinks, well, why didn't I follow this, passion I had for art? And, Margot's like, God, how did I just get lost in this marriage? And there's just a lot of thinking back on their lives then and now. And I love that idea. So if I would have set them in the 40s or the 50s or the 90s, that storyline wouldn't have worked. And that was really ultimately what I decided to kind of go for in this story.
Get it. Yeah, and that makes total sense. I loved all the cultural and historical references in 67 and 77. I loved all the musical references, especially. Um,
Yeah.
what was your research like? Like what sources did you use to research those eras?
Okay, so to research, what it was like out in the Hamptons at that time, I talked to all local historians and went to the library and looking at images. So that was sort of covered through a lot of interviews and whatnot. But a lot of what we do is figuring out, what people were talking about at the time and what movies they were watching and what music they were listening to. And I decided to kind of flesh out the time period somewhat by putting the girls in a record store working because I feel as though music in that time period was so influential in people's lives. I think music has always been influential, right? But during that point there was just so much singing of change and protest and empowered youth and having that as the backdrop. And I put in 35, I think it's like maybe 37, I don't know, songs in this book where they're sort of pulling from all these songs that you and I really know, from even just our parents, and the Beatles. And I actually started with wanting to write a scene at Shea when the Beatles come play in 1963. I like wanted so bad to write that scene that I was like, how can I get them in 1963? But I had to let go of it. I do have them mentioning that they were at Shea at that concert, but not together. Um, but I find just the way everyone was so obsessed with music and the Beatles and the Beach Boys and then Mick Jagger and I mean the Rolling Stones, and it was so neat to have the characters connect over that. And even Thea with her boyfriend at the time, who then becomes her husband, music is such a part of them and their identity. So yeah, so what was I doing? I was listening to so much Beatles. Oh my God. I was listening to Beatles nonstop. I was listening to Ruby Tuesday. I was listening to Bob Dylan. I grew up, my parents, I wouldn't necessarily call them hippies, but they were definitely products of the late 60s. And I grew up with my dad as a musician, right? You too? Yeah. Exactly. So
Totally.
like my dad was playing Painted Black in my living room growing up and I'm dancing around, music was just such a part of our lives. My mom has taken me to a couple Bob Dylan concerts over the years, where I'm sort of dragged, but also in awe of him. But I also loved writing about the 70s in part because I was born in 75. So here I am a little bit pushing in, unlike when I write about the 50s, where I really am researching, what their clothes were like and, what mannerisms, what people were saying. I didn't have to do that quite as much because I can pull a little bit from historical memory myself. So in this book, they go there. I think Jaws is playing at the movie theater. No, it's not Jaws. Sorry, that's my next book. It's Star Wars is playing at the movies, and they were all talking about that. There's like Underoos. There's all these like fun things that
Cruise.
I sort of remember. Wheaties cereal, right?
Mhm.
It's like pushing into the late 70s and early 80s kind of comes into my mind somewhat. But my parents also left me with all of these great stories from that time, just like really glamorizing and fantasizing what that time period is like, which I think ultimately is really glamorized. Like I think it wasn't that great. But I because they were caught up in it. But they would tell me stories of my dad's band, maybe allegedly playing Andy Warhol's Epic Party out in Montauk, and my mom kind of staking out the Rolling Stones when they stayed in Montauk at the Memory Motel. So there's, there's a lot of them more than my other books. I would say my other books have family members who are like a grandparent or a great aunt. You hear their voices, or I heard their voices. You wouldn't hear them. But in this book, I really had a lot of influence from my aunts and my uncles and my parents, and looking at photos of like my aunt and uncle with like crazy hair and coats with like that look like Sherpas standing outside VW buses. Like that was this time. And so a lot of that does end up in this book.
How cool for you and how cool for them. Have they all read the book yet? Because that must be
Yes.
such a neat thing, to have that
Yeah.
family
I think
connection.
especially for my mom, because her stories really do flesh, like they really have stayed with me. And I think growing up, you're just like, yeah, mom, got it.
Right,
But then
right.
you get older and you start pulling from it. It becomes really fascinating. With Summer Darlings, my first book, I had this idea to, as historical writers, we're always trying to set the book in a real moment to help readers kind of get there with us. And so there's this point in Summer Darlings where Marilyn Monroe dies, because she really did die that summer in 1962 when my characters are together in Martha's Vineyard. And my mom had told me all these stories, like hilarious to me, where teenage girls were all crying when Marilyn Monroe died and falling into each other. And it was just this devastating moment for young women, which I found so fascinating. So, of course, in Summer Darlings, you've got like the women all like, oh, bawling, about Marilyn Monroe dying. So some of these stories that we tell our kids, I mean, I'm frightened by whatever's going to stick with my kids, but some of these stories we tell our kids end up making their way out at some point.
So funny. That's so good. Back to the dual timeline. I've never written a dual timeline novel. Was that always the plan? Do you find that difficult? Did you find it easier? Like I just the weaving of
Same.
in and out, like how?
Okay, so I am totally with you. I my first two novels were not dual timeline. And I was determined to write dual timeline only because so many books I love and so many of my favorite authors do write with dual
Mhm,
timelines. And I
mhm.
love reading them. I just think like it's so fun to have all the Easter eggs and have the characters deepen when you're going back and forth in time. But writing it, holy smokes, it was a beast. It was so hard. And what I realized early on is that it's really writing two completely different novels, or three, depending on how many timelines you're juggling. I just read Beatrice Williams's new novel, and there's so many timelines going on. I'm like, how did she do this? But so I started writing the 1977 sections first, and I remember getting like three chapters and feeling a rhythm of, okay, it's time to go back in time. And I wrote three chapters in the 1967 timeline, and then I started to move forward with 1977, and I realized, oh my gosh, I can't even write this. I need to go back in time and figure out what is going on between them and what happened in the first place. So I actually started a completely new Word document and took the original first three chapters from that timeline and just wrote the entire arc of that story, and didn't do anything on the later timeline. And
Oh,
it was way too long. I think it was like probably 80,000 words in itself. Just for
oh.
anyone listening, a novel shouldn't really be more than 90, 95 as historical fiction, right? We do push a little longer in historical, so that was okay, but still. And then I did the later timeline, and then I ended up cutting a lot and splicing them together, finding the right rhythm, figuring out which storylines were going to stay, and subplots were going to stay and which ones were going to go. So like I said, I'm a really inefficient writer, but it's the only way I know how to do it. I kind of have to get it all out and then figure out exactly what my story is going to, chisel and become. But yeah, I found it really hard. And here's the most hilarious part. So it's like we're always trying to, at least for me, I'm always trying to challenge myself and get better as a writer. But so my next book is dual timeline and also dual POV. So that was like another beast. I was like, oh my God,
Oh.
here we go.
Yeah, but I
But
understand.
it was fun. I do have to say, I love doing the dual timelines now that I've done two. Even though they're beastly and my head feels like it's going to explode, I do think you come away with so much more as the reader. And even as the writer, you can kind of have a lot of fun with the characters in the two timelines and make things pop up that were, a secret in the past that suddenly become known in the future. Or there's even just a t-shirt like the husband in this book, All the Summers in Between, he's always wearing his Ramones t-shirt because he's a huge Ramones fan, and it's like who he loved in the past. It just all ends up kind of coming around. So
Yeah, no, I think that You did it so well, and it's so difficult in my opinion, and I'm just, like, very yeah, I mean, I can understand why it's a beast, just, like, as a because you read as a writer, and I'm like, "Oh god, like, I don't know how she did this," like, it just seems very hard.
I
Yeah.
know it's so hard. And now when I read other dual timelines, I'm like really impressed because I can see
Ah,
just how much work it is for us to pull these things off, right? And
yeah,
when you're
for
doing
sure.
it, you're just sort of lost in it. We just kind of chug through and push.
Yes.
But I will say I finished it and I remember being like, that was really a nightmare. Like
Yeah.
that was really
I know.
hard. It was
The best
not
part is
easy.
when you're like, "Whew, done," like, at least for
Done.
now. Yeah.
Done. Yes, it's like that instinctive feeling when you write the end. Like, you're not really done, but you're done. Like, you got it out, right? And it's
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
Yeah, at
Exactly,
least for this
exactly.
draft. Yeah.
Yes. So on that note, I have a few writing related questions that I ask every author that comes on, and then we already have some questions in the Q&A, or people can put questions in the chat, and I will field questions for Brooke after these last few. Um, so I think I know this answer based on our conversation. Are you a plotter or a pantser? And it sounds like you're more of a pantser,
I'm
right?
definitely a pantser. I am not a plotter. I try to always know generally, obviously where I'm going to write to. I need to know somewhat the end. It doesn't have to be crystal clear, but I need to know somewhat. I was talking to Natalie Jenner recently, who I know most of your listeners probably know her work too. She wrote the Jane Austen Society, and then her latest one is Every Time We Say Goodbye. And she was saying that someone told her, although I'm not going to remember who she got the advice from, because I'm feeling like the advice came from her, to write to the middle. And I thought that was actually great advice because so often I do write to the end, but writing to the middle, that sort of climax in the middle where you're kind of figure out, how to push harder and through the challenges is actually really smart. And I'm going to do that with my next book because with the book I just finished, I didn't have that advice then, but I was thinking that's actually smart. So I think as that's about as far of a plotter as I get is knowing, what the beginning, middle, and end is going to be,
Yeah,
but all
yeah.
the rest of it is really in discovery, and I think that's okay. I mean, I like that. I found that when I tried to outline my second novel on Gin Lane, with bullets and here's chapter one, here's chapter, I completely ditched that outline and it became such a waste of time. I actually found like it was just like procrastination to write that outline because ultimately I had to sit and figure it all out on the page. I could say in chapter two, she's going to go to the store and run into her old beau, but until you're writing it, you're like, actually, she can't even recognize him. She can't even know it's him. And they're not even going to talk yet. And that's going to happen in chapter five when he pops up in the garden, whatever it is, I'm making this stuff up. But yeah, no, total, total pantser.
Love it. Yeah, no, and it is. It's just so it's always so interesting to me because it's like whatever gets you through. Like everyone has an absolutely different process. And I have, I always talk about Hank Philippi Ryan as a friend, and she's like, I just sit down every morning and I start writing, and I'm like, what are you doing? That like makes me want to break out in hives. Like, like so I fascinates me. Like
So you're
everyone
a
has
plotter. You're more of a
yeah, oh
plotter.
yeah, I am. Yeah, I'm a
See, I
total
would
plotter.
love to be a plotter. I think you are so much more efficient. Like you don't waste time the way I'm wasting time,
I,
like kind of going in a million directions. But
Yeah, I mean, that's not to say that I don't like double back and check. Like I plot, but then like every 4 or 5 chapters, I'm like, okay, where is this going? Am I still going in the right direction? Did I
yeah, right.
totally like what year
Right.
is it? Yeah, so yeah, I'm not, it's not like a perfectly seamless process by any stretch. Um, so I know we always have aspiring authors in the audience, and you have been at this for a while now. What is the best advice you can give them about writing and about getting published? I know those are two very different things, but um,
Yeah. Okay. So I always say, and a lot of this comes from my journalism years too, which is I heard Ann Hull, who's a famous Washington Post reporter. She won the Pulitzer Prize at the Washington Post when she was there, and she ran a journalism conference once that I was at, and she wrote on the whiteboard, "Rewriting is a gift," and I like wrote that down on an index card and popped it on my desk when I was working at the magazine, and I keep it near me even today because I think so often we get bogged down in the rewrites and we think, oh, we're never going to finish. But there's really very few jobs where you get a do over and you get to keep trying and, make it better every time. And so I try not to see revision as, this horrible thing and instead see it as a gift because it really is in many ways. A lot of other writers will say this too, but it's just kind of get your butt in the seat, like, sit down and try to work on your pages a little bit every day. if you're not able to sit and work on the story every day, I always say sit with a notebook at lunch and daydream for 10 minutes and jot down something about the characters. Just try to keep your head in it, because I think that when every time you kind of let go of the story for 3 or 4 days or 3 or 4 weeks, it's so much work just to kind of ramp back up and figure out where you were in the writing, whether rhythmically or in the voice of the character. And last, when I was writing for so many different publications, I got really used to writing in the voices of those publications. You sort of get used to knowing how to write a story for a women's magazine versus the New York Times, versus a blog post. Sort of can be a chameleon in that way. And when I became a novelist, it was really the first time I heard my own voice as a writer and figured out what I wanted to say. And so I often say to people, don't be afraid to really listen to yourself and let your voice shine through. We want to hear what you have to say. People are going to want to read your stories. If you're interested and you're very passionate about the story, it's going to come through. So I know that's a little idealistic and not as like, I was doing a panel recently with a friend who's so much about the nuts and bolts, and her advice was that. But I really do think there is something to be said for believing in your voice and that you have a story to tell, because I think that does help, in the end, get you through to the end.
I think that's yeah, that's all excellent advice. And regarding having passion, I've started projects and put them aside because I didn't feel the passion and excitement for it. So I know that readers will immediately pick up on that because I do
Yep.
that. I can when I'm reading something. So yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of novelists will say this, like when you're really in the story and in the zone, you just start hearing the characters talking to you. They're talking to you when you're on the grocery line, you're seeing a scene while you're laying in bed falling asleep. It's kind of pumping within you. And
Mhm.
you sort of want to work to get to that moment, right? Because that's when the story has really taken hold of you, and that's how the pages will kind of get written, I think. Don't you think?
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, and when I'm on deadline, it's true. Like, I mean, it's like before you go to sleep at night, when you're in the shower, you have to kind of like the juices are flowing. You can't turn that off, or or I find too, I have to like dictate into my phone, or I'll totally
Yeah.
forget it like the next
Yes.
morning. So,
I know my husband was like, put a pad and pencil next on the nightstand so you can write it down when you have ideas in the middle of the night. And I did that. I woke up, it was like chicken scratch. I had
oh
no idea
yeah,
what
like,
I wrote. It was
who,
nonsense.
what? Yeah.
Yeah.
So funny. So I love the cover, and I'm always interested, because covers are hard, and this is so summery, and it's like a painting.
Oh,
And how did you have any say in the cover? Or did they just like tell you it's your cover? How
okay,
does it
so
work?
my publisher gallery, they're like the dream team, because with every single one of my covers, they let me weigh in on them. So with this cover, they said to me, "Do you have any ideas for this particular novel?" And I said, "Look, there's this artist named T.S. Harris. I have three of her paintings hanging in my house. I love her artwork. She sells her prints on, she's a Laguna Beach based artist, but she sells her prints on One Kings Lane, Artfully Walls, all the standard places we would buy art. And she calls her artwork Sunshine Noir. So she paints all of these very moody mid-century women, in bathing suits or in really cool period dresses, sun hats. They're either on the deck of a boat or they're, sunning themselves at a pool. And so my art director looked into it, and they went to lease three images, and one of them had just been snapped up. And they came back with two. And one was the picture you're seeing with the white bikini. We immediately jumped on it. It's just she
Mhm.
looked the perfect age. It was the right bathing suit. We love that there were all these shadows on her, even though it's a really like carefree image of someone sitting at the pool. You can tell that there's some darker threads in the book. So we just completely fell in love with it. And then I think there's something to be said for the typography being amazing. It's so
Mhm.
period. The 1960s kind of typography I thought was great. And then came to find out that the license that had just got picked up was Beatrice Williams' Husbands and Lovers book,
Oh, no
which
way.
is also a T.S. Harris cover. Yes. So
Oh, wow.
Beatrice and I did a podcast recently, which I can't even believe I'm saying, because she was my favorite author of all time long before I became an author. So doing a
Oh,
podcast with her
that's
was like a
awesome.
dream come true. But we were joking that we have the two best looking covers on the, in bookstores right now, because they're both T.S. Harris paintings. And then coincidentally, Rowan Baird's The Divorcees, which came out in March, is also a T.S. Harris painting. So she's having this moment in publishing, which is
Amazing.
really cool. Yeah, it's
Oh,
really
that's
cool.
so cool. Yeah, Beatrice is coming on next month, as a matter of
Oh,
fact.
she
Yeah,
is. Oh,
yeah, yeah.
yay. Yes.
Oh,
So
that's
that is so
funny.
funny about the cover, right? But yeah, if
Yeah,
anyone looked at her cover, you'll notice it's a completely different vibe, different body, different woman. But you'll see it's very, similar. It's that same
of
sunshine
the
noir.
style. Okay, very
Yeah.
cool. Okay, so you alluded to what you're working on now. Do you want to talk a little bit more about it?
Yeah. So my next book comes out next summer and we just named it. It's called Our Last Vineyard Summer and it takes place on Martha's Vineyard. So I go back to Martha's Vineyard. I had enough of Eastern Long Island. No, I'm just kidding. But I actually really wanted to go back to the vineyard. My husband and I started going there many years ago when we lived in DC and it's a very popular place for people, living and working in DC. And
Yeah.
that's kind of oddly how I ended up going there, even though I grew up going to Block Island and all different New England beaches. We had never gone to Martha's Vineyard. But anyway, it's about a family. It's more of a family saga, and it's about three sisters who are grown. They reunite at the beach house in 1978. Their mother calls them home because she's this Gloria Steinem like iconic figure and she calls them home because their father, who was a longtime United States senator, had passed away a year ago, and there's some financial trouble, and she thinks they have to sell the house. And when the girls come back home, there's a lot of kind of tension that sisters have, that fun sister kind of, I don't know, ups and downs. I'm one of three sisters, so I get that.
Okay.
Like and all these family secrets are revealed and kind of take them back in time. Actually, no, sorry, it doesn't take them back to time, but the story goes back in time. So that's through one of the sisters' points of view, the 1978 timeline, and the 1965 timeline is told through Virgie, the mother. And it's sort of the girls are young and they're on the vineyard, and it kind of helps you understand how she became this Gloria Steinem like iconic figure. Um, so her husband's a senator by then. And yeah, so it's kind of this Washington political family, beach house in peril, sisters unite in the later timeline, but the sisters have all this stuff going on. So it's honestly, I love this book. I think it's really, really fascinating to read just because of this character that's this Gloria Steinem like figure and what it's like to be a mother. And it's kind of asked the question, like, what if Gloria Steinem was your mother? Like, what would that actually be like if you were kind of getting that messaging at home and maybe some of you eat it up and some of you reject it? So that kind of gets at a little bit what it's about.
Very cool. And you're thinking next summer for that one? When's the
Yeah,
pub
next
date?
summer. I don't have the exact date, but I think it's June 2025, right? Do I have the year right? Yeah.
Yeah,
June.
yeah.
Yes. Too many book
You're
events. I'm like, what year
you're
is
busy. I
it? Yeah.
know.
So right
Okay,
now I'm in the mode of coming up with a book for if I can the following summer or the summer after that.
that is an ambitious schedule. God love you.
Okay.
That's amazing. Yeah, yeah.
Who knows? We'll see, right? I'm not making
Right.
any promises here.
Right, right. So before I take these questions from the audience, how best can readers stay in touch with you?
Oh, okay. So I'm on Instagram, Brooke Lea Foster. I have a great fiction-based Substack about my books, but also lots of other books called dearfiction.substack.com. I'm on Facebook, Brooke Lea Foster Writes, and I am on TikTok, but I'm not very active there. But Brooke Lea Foster there too.
Awesome, perfect.
Yeah.
And okay, so questions. Who was the hardest character to write in this story and why? That's from Anissa. Excuse me.
Oh,
Hi,
I
Anissa.
love Anita. Hi, Anita. I would say, one of the hardest characters to write, believe it or not, was Felix, who is the husband of Thea. And I think that's because when I first wrote him, I don't know why, because I did not intend for him to be a jerk, but he came off as such a jerk in the book. And my editor read it and she was like, why is he a jerk? Like he's saying sort of supporting things, but then he's kind of contradicting himself with his actions. And I just didn't even see it. This is why I love editors, right?
Oh
And
yeah.
so I went back and I really thought about what their marriage was going to be like and what had happened between them. Because I think it's really a loving marriage. There's not there's no big problem. No one wants to get divorced. No one wants to live without each other. But there's just this sense of abandonment, I think, on Thea's part, where she feels as though, her husband has really looked out for his own career and he hasn't really thought about the fact that maybe she even wants one. And that's the time period, right? I mean, that's really realistic. And I think that also happens a lot today, even with women who are figuring out, how they're going to work, putting together their family and their job. So I would say I had to really spend a lot of time with him, believe it or not. Margot, of course, she's selfish. She's so, so many people dislike her. She makes so many bad choices. She's not always nice to Thea. But I could really empathize with someone like Margot. I've had friends like Margot whose parents, really are very lonesome in their home, and all they want is to be loved by the people around them, and they kind of get the attention in all the wrong ways. So that
Hmm.
was hard to make the reader still kind of find a shred of empathy for her and still kind of care about her. So I spent a lot of time working on that one as well.
Oh yeah.
That was the most natural to me. I feel like I'm a local beach girl. I can kind of get that girl, local beach girl with problems. That was sort of me. So I can kind of write that kind of character much more easily.
Very cool. This is a good question. Sharon Person, hello, Sharon asks, did you create a playlist for this book? I loved all the references to various songs that were popular at the time. Do you have a Spotify playlist?
Okay, so people have been asking me to do this, and I actually spent an hour one day before the book came out, right, listing every single song that's in the book, and I'm determined to make one of these playlists, and if I do, I will put it up on social media, but I have not yet. But I wrote to the music endlessly, and with every book, I always have one song that really kind of sticks with me and helps me write those really emotional scenes. And with this book, it was Yellow Brick Road by Elton John, which is really from the latter timeline, not from the earlier one. But to me, that song, regardless of what Elton John wrote it about, that song is so much about longing and regret and kind of going back and making amends with someone, and just thinking of the past in such a nostalgic way. And I feel like when the friends reunite in that 70s timeline, that's really what they're doing, grappling with if they want to stay friends, but also, holding on to this very golden moment in time they had together, before this tragic thing happened between them. So no, I haven't made the playlist yet, but yes, music was a huge part of the book, and that song is really a good companion song for the novel.
Amazing. Now, can you this is my own question. Can you write listening to music with lyrics? Like I can listen to music, I just can't listen to lyrics when I'm writing.
Okay, so I don't listen to music unless I'm writing emotional scenes, and then I
Okay.
do them with lyrics. So when I'm kind of like getting into a scene and kind of developing it, if I were listening to music that whole time, I would find it really distracting. But when
Hmm.
I'm writing a climactic emotional moment where I really want to dive into their hearts and really kind of pull out the juice of what they're saying, what they're really saying, what the code language is, that's when I use music. And then what I do is, and tell me, Jane, if you do this, but I then like will reread what I wrote with the beginning of the song and kind of get to the climax of the song as I'm, kind of timing it so I get to that emotional punch of the moment and then like feeling the line and then writing a word, another sentence. That's sort of
Oh,
how I'm using music. I use it really to propel the scene emotionally.
that's super cool. No, I don't do that. That's really
You'll
interesting.
have to try it because it really does
Yeah.
work.
I do have like my last the book that I just turned in takes place in like 1947 and I have like contemporary songs for all the characters, like their theme songs that
Oh,
I
I
like.
love that. Like
Yeah.
what?
Like for the main character's love story, The Alcott by The National is like their love story song. Yeah. And
Oh
like
my God, how
yeah.
cool. Yeah, so
Yeah.
similar, similar.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So like, yeah, just to get the vibe of like the relationship and yeah, all of that. Yeah,
Yeah, right.
that's
But
funny.
day to day, you wouldn't listen to it, right? But at like writing, but then you listen to it when you're like thinking about them and thinking about, is
Yes.
what you're saying?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah. But like I can listen to I have Spotify like study music playlists and stuff that are all instrumental. Like that I can write to that. But yeah.
interesting. Yes, like
Yeah.
the movie soundtrack music, right? I can
Yes,
write to that.
exactly.
Yeah,
Oh,
but
that's some good
sometimes I
stuff.
just like don't even, I just turn it off because it's like you just want the quiet.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, but I can write to that.
This is actually another music related question from G. Spencer. Did you have to get permission to use song references or did you only use titles, which I think you did? I'm asking because I'm writing a novel set in 1946 and want to use some musical references. I have some advice on this too, but what about you, Brooke?
No, I was gonna say you give your advice because for me, the time that's reaching further back in time, which I think has different rules. But for me, I did have song lyrics in and I had to take them all out. And I was so sad because, you know, you just want to put in a line or two. They say you can put in like, I think one line. Otherwise, you have to, it's right, it's one line. Otherwise, you have to paraphrase. And so I did paraphrase the songs. And the truth is, what I realized, it's like I want to put in the lyrics because that's what I'm feeling at the moment. But once I let go of the draft and it came back to me from my editor after 6 weeks or something, I realized that you actually didn't need the lyrics. Like, you know, all of us know the songs, at least the songs I'm referring to. So paraphrasing it actually worked just fine.
Yeah, yeah, they're really strict with music lyrics. Unless you're Stephen King, I know he has like "Don't Fear the Reaper" lyrics in The Stand. I'm like, well, of course they're going to pay for the lyrics, the
Yeah,
copyright for that because it's Stephen King. But
right, exactly. They're probably like, take it.
yeah, exactly. Like every book I've written, I have music lyrics in for the first draft, and they're always like, "Jane, you got to take these out. We like you should know by now." But I'm always like, "Oh, maybe I
Oh,
could just
so
fix
the
this
40s
little."
isn't fair use yet. What is fair use then? Is fair use 100 years? What is fair
I
use?
I think fair use is 100 years from copy if the copyright has not been
Oh, that's right.
recorded.
Okay. Yeah.
But also with music in particular, with song lyrics, they're more strict. In my experience, they're way more strict than other references. Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
know why or how, but they are. Yeah.
Yeah, my agent was like, "You can leave them in, but you really risk it becoming an issue." And so who's gonna want,
Yes.
no one wants that, you know? She's like,
Yeah.
"Sometimes they notice, sometimes they don't, but I wouldn't do it." I was like, "Yeah, I'm not doing it then." You know,
Yeah,
like,
yeah, exactly. Like why like put that obstacle, like why create a problem that you don't have to deal with? Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Exactly.
It's a shame though, because it's, you wanna use them so bad.
I know, yeah, especially yeah, it's such an influence obviously on your writing and on my writing. So yeah, totally. Um, oh, so Joan Barlow asks, you are doing a book tour. You've been doing a book tour. Are you still do you still have events coming
I
up?
do, yes. So I know most of my events are done, but I do have events on Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, Cape Cod, Warren, Rhode Island, Shelter Island, and out on Eastern Long Island where I'm based. But all of my dates in the South and the Mid Atlantic are done. So those, my book came out on June 4th, and so I kind of did that push early on, and now I'm kind of focused on the New England area. But if Joan, if you're from the New England area, please come out for one of those events. All of my tour information can be found right on my Instagram page, and also on my Dear Fiction page. So.
Awesome. Perfect.
I know it's
What
one of the perks of writing summer beach novels is you get to
yes.
go to summer beach towns. It's like
Go to
we're
some
always
good
in these great, beach locales.
yeah, that's awesome. One last question from Anissa. What are you both reading now? What are you reading right now? If you have
Okay,
time.
so
I know it's like
shocker, shocker. I just finished Beatrice Williams' new novel, Husband and Lovers. I mean, I
uh,
have to always read her books first. I'm telling you, I've adored her since 100 Summers. So I loved Husbands and Lovers. I just finished before that Sandwich by Catherine Newman, which everyone on earth is reading. And
oh
now,
yeah. Is that
right?
good? Yeah,
It's
yeah, I
really
haven't
good.
finished.
It's really good. Some people are now panning it. I think it got overblown. So then people read it late and they're like, oh, it's not that good. It's actually that good.
Oh, okay.
It's really about nothing. And yet it's about so much and a complicated family. And it's really beautiful. Her prose is gorgeous and she's just a very insightful writer. And next up for me is actually a book I bought down in Greenville, South Carolina, which is where Anissa is from, because I have actually met Anissa, and that is Ali Condi's The Unwedding. And I
Okay.
carried it around with me, and now I'm finally getting to it, and I'm on the first chapter and love it so far. So I think it's a Reese pick. It was a Reese pick, but
Oh
it
yeah,
takes
yeah.
place in Cal, it's got that setting and it's at a hotel, and apparently she goes out to the pool and finds a dead body and she's divorced from her. I don't know. It's got like all the makings of a good summer book. So I grabbed that one.
Perfect. Yeah, and I am reading, and this is a good wrap up. Erica Roebuck's latest, The Last 12 Miles.
I
Uh,
loved it. She's the
I'm
best.
almost done because she's coming on Thursday night, so you can all register for her webinar Thursday night. And then the other one is my friend Marjan Kamali just came out with The Lioness of Tehran.
Yes, it's on
Yeah,
my list. Oh my
yeah.
God. Are you
So
reading it yet or you're going to
I
read it?
have it. So that's
Okay.
next on my list because I'm going to read that this weekend, and I love her writing, and she's just delightful person. So
Oh,
so
I want
yeah.
to meet her. So it's interesting. When I was at a Barnes and Noble event recently, I always ask the bookseller, "What's your favorite book? What do you love?" And she said, her novel, The Stationery Shop, which for
Yes.
some reason I just missed. You know those big books, they're huge, everyone read them, but
Yeah.
somehow you just missed it in time. So I
Yep.
bought it, and I wanna read that one first, and then I'm gonna read her new one. But there's so
Yeah.
many books, I just wanna read the it drives you crazy, right? Because it's
It's
like you
so
wanna read
hard. Yeah,
everything. I
yeah.
know.
So hard to get through them. Never mind blurbs and manuscripts of friends and all that. I'm sure you deal with it
Yeah,
too. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
all of
yeah, I
that.
know.
Brooke, this was delightful. Thank you so much for coming on tonight. This was so fun.
This is so fun, and I feel so lucky that I've, gotten to meet you and get to know you a little bit too.
Yeah, likewise. Hopefully, we'll run into each other in person sometime soon. That would be awesome.
Yes, that would be great. When does your next book come out? I'm sure people on the Zoom all know about it, but when does it come out?
It comes out, God willing, spring 2025. We don't
Oh,
have a
so
date or
soon.
anything. Yeah, yeah. So I'm getting my edits back any day now, and I'm gonna run terrified from the room when I get them, and then I'll be okay.
No, because you know what you're gonna do? You're gonna say rewriting is a gift.
It's a
It's
gift.
a
I know. I think I need that little thing taped to my wall. But thank you again, and thank you for everyone for tuning in tonight, as always. And yeah, please keep in touch, Brooke. Thank you, and best of luck with your book. Everyone
All
should
right.
read it. Perfect summer read. All the summers in between. All right.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much, everyone, for coming,
everyone.
and thank you, Jane.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye bye.